So the videos, it's a lot of information coming to you all at one time. And so the good thing is that even though we do this chat now, if during the week you know that there's one video, one specific portion want to go rewatch and just give yourself time to let these concepts kind of sink in, knowing that what you watched yesterday and today might not be 100% ingrained yet, but through our chat, you can always go back to the videos throughout the course and recap it, because that's exactly all of this. It's like new terminology, new concepts, new frameworks, new ideas. And when you move on through other parts of the course and then you come back to it, you'll be looking at it with fresh eyes once again. But yes, watching the videos without the interaction is definitely a whole different experience. Zama, what did you want to say?
Oh no, for me, I did biology between grade 10 and matric. So I felt like I was stuck in my biology class where I was falling asleep and I was just making a joke with my sister. It's like, it's funny how time just comes back to you. You thought you were over it, but now I'm back here again. But I found the first video of general anatomy, I could adjust to some of the terminology. But when I came to the stretching and strengthening part, I was just like, oh gosh, I need to repeat this again during the week.
Yes, so look, the general anatomy is what I want to really cover today, and just make sure we get that all ironed out. The strength and stretching is going to weave its way into all your classes, as well as things we'll chat about in peak post sequencing, things that, like we said, it's repetition and it's revision the whole time. So if we can get the general foundational aspects covered today, then that will really help you guys when we move forward. You will hear a couple of times in the videos, Catherine will say, look, you don't need to know this, so don't feel under pressure, especially with the really scientific biomechanics things. As Catherine said, those are things that took her ages to just let that sink in. So I also did my advanced training a year back, and sometimes I have to listen to it again and go, okay, hold on, right, cool, remind myself, I got it. And then over time, you finally feel as though you have a grip on it, but it's incredibly scientific. And because it's quite, because it's got that biomechanics approach, it's very research based. So I think Catherine mentioned that book called The Science of Stretching, the Jules Mitchell's book. I'll clarify the name with you guys. That's kind of like a book where you read a page or two and you go, okay, I'm going to let that sink in, and you read the same 2 pages tomorrow and you go, wait, did I read this yesterday? And then you build on and eventually it comes. So there's quite a lot of technical concepts in that stretching and strengthening. So if those are the overwhelming parts, that's okay. We're going to cover the general today and leave here feeling a little bit more confident. All right. So I think what I'm going to do is just briefly open up the chat, and then I would like us, obviously, if you guys have questions, I want to target those ones specifically, because your questions can also, might be something that someone else has already wondered or wants to know as well. So just to kind of recap about what we spoke about in our chat yesterday, just going over why we are learning the anatomy. So now after you've watched those videos, you might have a better understanding as to where these aspects or where this knowledge finds its way in our yoga teaching. All right. So the first one being that understanding anatomy with regards to what our bodies are doing or what we are instructing our students to do with their bodies. It's going to give us an understanding of the poses, right? So the first thing there was looking at the different joint movements. So when we are teaching or instructing into a certain pose, we know, okay, the hip joint is doing this, the shoulders are doing this, the wrists are maybe doing this, that is being strengthened, that's being stretched. And so that's where we're going to weave this information into analyzing the poses, all right? In order to understand the poses, and I think when we say pose analysis, we're speaking about the general alignment, the shape that we want them to achieve. That is going to be where we're going to weave in the understanding of the anatomy. All right. So I quickly want to cover the topic of alignment very early on, because I think you guys would have heard in the video, the first video, Catherine speaks quite a bit about alignment. All right. What is alignment? And, you know, why are we queuing for it, what's important about it. So I want to ask you guys any feedback or any insights you had with regards to cueing alignment. What does it mean? What does it mean to have an alignment in a pose, and why we would actually use it or not use it, or instruct it or not instruct it? Yemi, go ahead.
Hi. I think if I remember correctly, it does have a place for like the look of the pose, but it is more for mind-body awareness and to almost teach beginners, like, so you have a point of reference, because it's almost like if you just tell them to go down, it's kind of hard to judge as to where that needs to be. So it can form as a base, but naturally our bodies are asymmetrical. So there is a, you can only be so aligned in either way.
Yeah, so like you said, it's kind of the alignment that we have is the picture that we have in our mind about what the shape is supposed to look like. Do you guys remember that quote that said, looking at the alignment, you can't even look at alignment without thinking about the person in the pose, the person doing it, all right? Every single body, as you would have seen come up a number of times, everyone's different, right? We've all got different length arms, different flexibility, shorter legs, longer legs, shorter torso, whatever the case may be. We're all got different proportions. We've all got we've all got different bones. We've all got different flexibility levels. And so when we're thinking about alignment, it's really nice to think about, instead of the word alignment, to think of the person in the pose, all right? So often the yoga that we practice, and maybe you guys have experienced this in studios, we're told to put like knee over ankle, and more so than, the intention of it is to say, okay, well, if you put your knee over your ankle, it's unsafe or it's dangerous, but not really, right? There's no link between those those cues or alignment cues and the actual prevention of an injury, right? So let's look at the example of, let's say, a warrior two. One of the typical cues we give is to say, okay, don't put your knee over your ankle. Okay. And what about in Malasana? What about like a yogi squat? Have you ever heard a teacher say, don't put your knee over your ankle in a yogi squat? Because you won't get into the pose, right? So that was kind of the idea we just wanted to get across to you. Sometimes we say certain things and then we have to pause and go, wait, hold on, why are we saying it? Does that really make sense? Where instead we can use these cues of alignment as a means of, like Demi said, instructing students into a pose, to give beginners an idea of what the shape looks like and maybe how to get into that pose or what you're working towards, all right? Not in a means of saying, okay, if you don't do it, then your knee's going to explode or your shoulder's going to break or something like that, just so that we know that alignment cues are not always a prevention cue. All right, does that make sense? Okay, cool. That was one of my notes. I just wanted to get that straight off the bat. So we need to have this level of understanding of anatomy so that we can cue certain poses, so we can understand certain poses that'll weave its way into our analysis, weave its way into our sequencing and into our teaching as a whole. So let's go straight to square one, where we're looking at the anatomy of our specific joint movements or specific joint directions, different ways in which each joint can move. That is going to form a very, very, very big portion of your pose analysis and your sequencing, all right? So that's really what I want to nail and get down today. So before we do a little bit of an activity with it, are there any major questions you guys wrote down first? Let me ask that before I offer all the answers. Okay, Trudy, yes.
I was just not sure when talking about flexion and extension. So with the hips, it makes sense. With the shoulders, but the wrists. So I couldn't wrap my brain around this being extension and this being, because I mean, usually when you fold forward, the easier thing to do usually is the natural thing is the flexion and the sort of, so that is why, I don't know, the wrists, that just didn't want to go and sit in my brain.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think when we're looking at the hips and the shoulders, not that they're not alike at all in the same of the joint, but they're both ball and socket joints. So they've got multiple different movements. They've got flexion, extension, external, internal rotation, all of extra things. The wrist itself, okay, they're a little bit complicated because the wrist can do flexion. I can't go ahead and tell you why this is flexion and why this is extension. It's one of those things you just remember. But the wrists also can do rotation. They can actually also do something called, and this is actually not to make it, it's kind of deviation. You see how even if I keep my forearm straight, my wrist can also go side to side, all right? If I bring side to side, forward and back all together, that's where I get rotation. In yoga, we don't really do wrist flexion, all right? When are we ever, you might do one stretch where you're on your hands and knees and you're putting the tops of the hands on the floor as a means of stretching through the front of the hand and the forearms. That's just if you're doing general kind of wrist stretches. But mostly in yoga, it's extension. When you come to learning the terms flexion, extension, it is just about finding little tricks for you that help you remember it in a way. So I always remember flexion as like little bunny ears. I can't remember why, and extension, but it is, I think the wrists are one of the things we actually use quite a lot in yoga, but it's not one of the more complicated with regards to the positions that you have. The good thing about wrists is that we generally mostly use them in extension. So that's kind of a nice way to remember it, is it's like you only have them one way. But I like what you mentioned there, and you kind of introduced with the shoulders. And I think let's go shoulders and then hips and really look at one joint at a time, so that while we're speaking about and asking questions, we can really hone in on one specific aspect. So when it comes to shoulders, do we feel as though we have that understanding of the different movements of the shoulders? Because we use them a lot in yoga, right? Like a lot. All right. Okay, no other questions about that, because then we're going to play a little bit of an activity or game where I'm going to call out a movement and we're going to do it. And if there's anyone who felt like they were a little bit unsure, we can chat about it and explore. Okay, so I'm not going to do it with you. Let's see where our shoulders will go if we bring our shoulders into flexion. You guys can do it. Yeah, okay. So hands along the side, you guys have all got it. I like to remember flexion comes forward. There's no action mean, but they come up in front of us, okay? So you guys will see in your anatomy work, you'll start to measure all these things. This is one where you measure up against the wall and you see, okay, how far can I bring my hands up or behind me? Let's see who's got, so Demi, I want you guys to watch Demi. And I think Zama, quickly bring your arms up again. No, yours are fine. We can actually use mine as an example. Okay, so Demi, I'm gonna ask you to turn to the side. Just face somewhat sideways. Now I want you guys to all look at Demi's teeny little block. Can you bring your shoulder up into flexion? Okay, can you guys see where Demi's shoulder goes? Can you see that her biceps are almost behind her ear? Just put your neck quite straight, so your head just in a neutral position above your shoulders. Okay, cool, so it is already. So you see Demi's got quite a lot of shoulder flexion. Look at mine. Okay, if I bring my head up, it's not bad. That's normal, right? So I don't get to 180, mine's like maybe 170 or so. So if I had my back up against the wall and I lifted my arms up, what's gonna happen if I can't get there? I might arch into my spine slightly in order to get my hands there. Okay, if you guys have been watching Catherine's Instagram, she speaks about that a lot. But you can already see that between Demi and I, if we had to do maybe wheel pose, they would look completely different. She's got a lot of shoulder flexion, a lot more range in her shoulder. For me, it's not there. I might have to find that in other places. My shape will look completely different. And if a teacher says to me, no, but your pose must look like this, I'm sorry, my bones are not going there. Like maybe there's some elements, some kind of shoulder flexion stretches I can bring into my classes, but a certain element of it will just be that is where my body's at. All right, so that was a perfect example of shoulder flexion and the differences in the bodies. All right, so this will be really fun for you guys when you do your homework to go and look and see what your range is like. Not only with the shoulders, you guys are going to do the hamstrings and stuff like that. And when you can observe it in your own body, you'll be able to notice differences amongst practitioners and also differences in your students. Okay, let's go into shoulder extension. Nice. So back behind us. Cool. Can you guys think of a pose that maybe has shoulder extension?
Warrior 3.
Warrior 3 with maybe an airplane arms variation. You can also Prasarita, what with interlacing the fingers?
Yeah, Prasarita C, I think it's.
Yes. So Prasarita also pretty much a bind behind the back. For those who are doing your back bend sequence, you guys have that in your sequence. So yes, anything with arms behind us. Trudy said Warrior 3. So this would be aeroplane. If I brought my hand into full your full Warrior 3, shoulders are actually in flexion. Yes, okay. So different variations. I want to go into that example. I think you guys have maybe covered this briefly with Laura. If I have my arms behind me in a Warrior 3, do you think it's going to make it easier or harder than full? Kind of touching on the strength a bit.
Easier.
Yeah.
Easier. Why would it be easier with my hands behind me?
The load.
All right. If I bring my arms forward in a Warrior 3, it's going to make the pose
More difficult.
a little bit more difficult. Yeah. There's a little bit more load. The load is moving forward. The lever is a little bit longer. All right. So it's just going to be a bit harder. Did you guys explore that in your classes with regards arms back and arms forward? Yeah. I remember Laura said you guys did. Okay. So that's now you're understanding we kind of went from range into a little bit of the loading, but it's nice to weave them in together and we start to see how things are somewhat interconnected. Okay. Kind of a tricky one, but shoulder external rotation. Okay. I've got to look at your teeny little blocks here. Okay, this is one I wanted to cover again because it's kind of hard to see on the video and I want to relate it to yoga poses. So I want you to bring your arms out to the side and bring your thumbs up and then you'll turn your thumbs back to the wall behind you. Okay, what position? So your palms are facing up. That's how it should be. Okay, in what external or internal rotation of our shoulders now?
External.
External. All right. And if I bring my, let's bring my thumbs down, you might not get them all the way to the back of the wall. Do you see how my shoulder is rotating inwards? Do you see that? Internal rotation. Okay. So that's kind of, we don't do it a lot in yoga, but well, actually we do really, because it's different variations in poses where you're reaching the arm back. It can go either way. It actually really helps if we can understand this, especially in poses like in dances, right? In dances, our hand goes back, so it's in, or our shoulder goes backwards. So this position would be firstly. If it comes back behind me, what kind of motion would that be, or direction rather?
Extension.
Extension. And then generally we cue our dancers pose to have thumbs up and to hold the inside of the foot. So I'm also getting a little bit of external rotation. It's a little bit of a stretch through the front of my body, right? Some people kind of hold differently and it rotates the shoulder inwards, but for dancers, we open it up. So that's just kind of, it's mostly extension, but cool, let's just add on a bit. Can we think of a pose where we would have our shoulder in internal rotation? It's kind of a tricky one.
Reverse prayer?
Yes, reverse prayer. So it's kind of reverse namaskar. You're bringing the hands behind the back. You feel that the shoulders kind of rotate inward. So that's right. Yeah.
And then,
yes, Caroline?
That pose, it's like upside down. I don't know what it's called. It's like, it's upside down full wheel tabletop, but with your feet flat on the ground, but then your shoulders.
Yeah, so reverse plank.
Yes, reverse plank. There we go.
So reverse plank, I've got my palms behind me and
yes.
then my legs are straight in front of me, all right?
Yeah.
That's more like your shoulders an extension. Yeah, a little bit. One of the ones that is probably the easiest for us to understand it is to come into cow facing arms. So I want you to bring your right arm out to the side, turn your palm down, so your thumb down, and then just bring your back of your hand to the space between your shoulder blades. And then bring your left arm out to the side, palm facing up, and reach it back. All right. I want you to feel the differences in the shoulder. The top arm is kind of in flexion, but it's open up slightly in the front here. My bottom arm, or my bottom shoulder rather, is coming into internal. So you can feel they're somewhat different. All right, you can try it out on the other side. Elena's getting bombarded by children. That's fine. All right. So one of the poses where we really get internal rotation is when we're coming into cow face, or also when we're doing binds, right? So when we're trying to come into birds of paradise, as an example. Okay, any questions about the shoulders as such? What are the shoulders doing in a warrior two? Forgot there's another one. Yeah. So what is this one for? Yeah, Caroline, sorry, go again.
Abduction.
Abduction, yeah. And if I bring them towards my body?
Adduction.
Cool. Do you guys notice the difference between we're now studying, we should say abduction and adduction. A little trick that I remember for that is if I had to imagine my arms were getting abducted, they were coming up, and then I'm going to add them back to my body. Same thing applies to, just going to teach you guys all the little tricks I found on the way. Bringing them up and bring them to the body. The same thing applies for the hips. Okay. All right, so we're good with the shoulders. We feel like we've got somewhat of a grip on that. Okay, let's take it a little step further. Let's see how far we can push our understanding about this range. Okay, if I'm in a downward facing dog, in what position are my shoulders in? Yeah.
Aren't they
Flexion.
internally rotated?
What say the others? The main movement.
No.
Flexion.
Flexion.
Yeah.
Cool. Flexion. And if I come into plank, what are they in?
Extension. No.
So now think, okay, let's quickly stand.
Retraction.
Let's make this fun. All right, so let's stand up because I want you to pretend. If you're in a downward facing dog, your biceps are kind of in line with your ears. I'm just going to go onto my knees, okay? I'm in, we said flexion down dog, all right? Now in plank, your hands are pretty much underneath your shoulders. So let's just bring plank sideways. So we imagine we're just doing plank in a different position, all right? What position are my shoulders in now?
Neutral.
Okay, this would be in neutral.
That's
Well,
neutral.
I guess neutral's not really the right word for it, but this would be kind of our starting position of our range. Move your hands through to downward dog, through flexion. I'm in flexion. I'm still in flexion.
Mhm.
Downward dog just
Yeah,
requires
probably flexion.
more flexion than a plank.
Oh, okay.
We got that. Okay, so this would be our, we'll only move from flexion into extension when we almost bring it past the body and back behind us. Okay, cool. Does that make sense? Cool. So I think it was Demi there who mentioned the protraction and the retraction. So you might have to recall back to one of the first videos you watched where Catherine spoke about the scapula. And that's almost where you're rounding in the upper back. It's not spinal, it's pushing through the shoulder blades and retracting. Okay, that's protraction and retraction. Not so much, it's not only in isolation with the shoulders, it's kind of, even if my shoulders are there, I could get that little bit of a movement in the upper back. Okay, it's not a rounding and a arching like in a cat cow. It's as if you were in a plank and you just had to push the mat away from you, rounding through the upper back. All right. The main part that we really get protraction and we want to fully round, can we think of where we might want to do that in yoga?
Cat.
Plank, yeah. It's kind of another one as well.
Yeah, cat pose. Yeah, well, cat pose. If you so from
Yeah,
cow and then cat.
In cat, you'll bring both. You'll find people will round through their back, into their back to get spinal what? What movement of the spine? Someone said it. Where did that come from?
Flexion.
Spinal flexion. And you probably could do a little bit of protraction and get kind of through the shoulder blades as well. We see it a lot in plank specifically, where teachers will cue push, push up through the space between the shoulder blades, or push into the mat, create space between the shoulder blades. That's that protraction action. All right. You might, you only get it in a plank really. Little bit of like when we're doing arm balances like crow, where we really want to round. And so that's kind of where that weaves in. Okay. Let's think of one more shoulder thing. And then, well, we have done a lot of it. Any shoulder questions? These things will weave in. Okay. Let's move on to the spine, and then we'll come down to the hips. Okay. So the spine's got quite a lot of different movements as well. Let's name one movement of the spine. We said now flexion. In which category or which type of poses as a general will we maybe see things like flexion?
Forward fold.
Forward folds, yeah. Sasha, did you want to say the same one?
Yeah, I was going to say forward bends.
Forward bends, yeah. And when we do forward bends, I'm going to try and link them together. When we get forward bends, might have a little bit of a rounding into the spine. Where else do we, okay, let's rephrase. When we do forward bends, what position do we get in the hips?
Flexion.
Hip flexion. Okay, all right. Coming back up to the spine, if we're not doing flexion, we could go into extension. Example of spinal extension would be?
Upward dog, for pose.
Yeah, back bends. Upward facing dog, wheel, cobra, shalabhasana, like all of those kind of poses where you're doing spinal extension or generally your back bends. Okay. We also get twists, which is just rotation of the spine. And then we get the last one, which is lateral flexion. So that just means I'm bending. So remember, flexion means bend. All right. So flexion to the side, you'll get lateral flexion to the left, lateral flexion to the right. Okay. Cool. The spinal ones we tend to know, rotate, twist. We got that. Okay. All happy with the spine. Okay. Let's move down to the hips. I want to spend some time here because you guys know in yoga, we do a lot with the hips. Okay. So let's start off with flexion. All right. So as you guys have mentioned, flexion is when you are doing your forward folds. And flexion can happen in two ways. Okay. They're not different ways. It's two different ways in yoga in which we can see them come up. Okay. The first one being when I am standing. I'm going to demo with you guys. Okay, so Uttanasana, hips are in flexion, right? You guys agree? Okay, when I'm in hip flexion, what am I stretching?
Hamstrings.
Hamstrings over here. Okay, cool. You guys spoke a lot about hamstrings because in yoga we stretch hamstrings a lot. Okay, what am I doing here? With my top leg. Oh, sorry, say that again.
Flexion.
Just go to, before we go into the muscles contraction, just think about the joint movement first. We'll build on from there. So my hip is coming into this one.
Flexion.
Flexion.
Right? So in flexion, I can either bring, it seems pretty obvious, right? But it's just kind of thinking about different ways in which you're doing it. So I can bring my upper body to my thighs. I'm in hip flexion. I can also bring my thigh to my upper body. It's still flexion. All right. So it's pretty much closing off the body. Does anyone remember how much hip flexion we have as a range?
Around 120 degrees?
Around 120, yeah. So that's kind of quite a good range of motion. And anyone remember in extension?
30 degrees.
30, right? So there's not a lot of range in extension, all right? That's because we walk forward, we move forward, we climb. If you need to climb, you need to be able to reach up. You need to be able to bring your knees up. So our bodies are designed for shoulder and hip flexion, okay? Let's go into, okay, let's give an example, all right? I want you, I'm gonna make this practical. I want you guys to get into a pose, a standing pose, where your front hip is in flexion, your back hip is in extension. Don't even look at the screen. Or maybe one person gets it and then everyone can just copy their little block. So a standing pose where your front hip is in flexion, your back hip is in extension. Take some time to play around with it, right? So feel, can I? Okay, I'm seeing a couple here. Seems like most of us. There's some interesting. Caroline, are you doing a twisted triangle? Sorry, I'm also sitting in a funny position trying to see you.
Yes, triangle B.
Triangle B. Okay. So yeah, rotate triangle. Okay, front flexion. Okay, cool. All come down to seated. There was quite a couple there. All right, so you got a different one. Probably the most prominent ones that you guys did was a lunge. Okay, lunge, front hip is in flexion, back hip is in extension. Okay, I saw Carmel do quite a cool one where she was looking at Warrior 3. Now, Warrior 3 is a pose that could be classified as a forward bend. What would be the reason we classify it as a forward bend? What do we think?
Back leg goes from extension to leaning forward, if I'm not mistaken.
So what's interesting about our Warrior 3, let's see if we can get it in here. My front leg, I'm moving my torso towards my hip, knocking down my furniture in the process. So I'm coming into hip flexion in the front one. This back leg is actually still in a straight line with my body. So with regards to hip extension, it's probably in the range of 0. I can still bring it up, right? Now I'm moving it into more extension, probably getting a little bit extra degrees. So you'll see some people come into their Warrior 3s in a different way. That's, there's a lot of factors coming into play here. You've got the standing leg where a lot of requirement from the hamstring, a lot of requirement from balance. Also the back leg's back behind you. You might have to really squeeze the glutes to get that leg up. So there's a lot of factors coming into play, but yes, generally a forward fold because I'm bringing my torso forward. Okay, does that kind of make sense? So most of your lunges, even coming into the balancing poses, those asymmetrical poses generally have a combination of different hip movements, all right? Let me come into maybe a more, okay, let's introduce the other movements and then we're going to look at how different movements manifest together. So let's come into, I want to start off easy and then make it a little bit harder. Okay, cross-legged, seated cross-legged. What position have we got in the hips?
Extension.
So think about, let me think. Seated cross-legged as I am now. I'm going to hold your thought there, Caroline. I'm just going to see what everyone else says and then I'll answer. So who else wants to give input as to what's happening when I'm crossing my legs?
External rotation. Yeah.
A little bit of external rotation. That's probably the main thing that's happening. Okay. If I'm folding forward,
Hip flexion.
yeah, still external rotation. Okay, a little bit of flexion, but when you guys are categorizing your poses, you're going to focus on the external rotation. That's the main thing that's happening here. All right, let's see if I'm standing in my pose here. All right, I'm just going to show my legs. This position here. Cool. What's happening in my lifted leg?
Abduction.
Cool.
With the B.
Abduction, right. It's coming out to the side. My toes are still facing forward. So when I'm in a Prasarita, okay, I'm coming into a forward fold. My toes are pointing towards you, and I'm getting a stretch on the inner thigh. What's happening with both of my legs?
They both abducted.
Both abducted. Yeah, you guys sound hesitant, but you're getting that. All right. Okay, I've got one leg out to the side, and now I'm twisting my toes. What's happening to this lifted leg? Turning
Externally rotated.
Sorry, say that again.
I was going to say external rotation with abduction.
Yes, okay. So it's two movements. So what I want you guys to see is that abduction and external rotation. All right. Okay, have you got that? So
What do you want? Okay.
So, okay, let's think of a pose where we've got abduction and external rotation. Standing pose. Maybe stand up. Let's all get up. I know it sounds funny, but when you do it, it's like, ah, it makes sense. All right, stand with your feet in abduction. So abduction means your feet are wider, good. Now make one or both hips externally rotated. See where your body goes to. Notice what I did with my toes in order to externally rotate. Cool. When you find your way into a yoga pose, give us a name of the pose you're doing. For those who are not on mute.
Goddess pose.
Okay. Now in goddess, what is the main motion of the hips? We might start from a Prasarita. So Prasarita is abduction. My toes are pointing forward. I then turn my toes out. Good. Mostly external rotation. And then you come into the pose. All right. So your toes are pointing outwards. So there's a bit of external rotation there. Let's see if we can find one more pose that has, yes. Caroline's got one. So she's doing Utthita Hasta Padangusthasana. So extended hand to big toe pose. So how we would get into the pose, let's do this one together. So I'm bringing my knee into my chest. My hip is coming into
Flexion.
flexion. Cool. You can bind your big toe, straighten out your leg. Legs coming out to the side. It's a bit of a tricky entrance into it. You are going to externally rotate that hip slightly to get your leg higher, not making it too complicated, but there's a bit of external rotation. Depends how you're coming into the pose. That's the general entrance into it. But we're seeing how our legs can go into flexion, out to the side, and rotate. Because it's a ball and socket joint, there's a lot of different ways in which the head of the femur can move in that hip joint socket. Okay.
And would that apply to happy baby pose as well?
Happy baby is predominantly hip flexion. You're bringing your knees, well, because they're quite coming into the chest, you might bring them out slightly. I guess you can feel it. Let's quickly go into happy baby. Let's see what happens. Maybe you just want to do one. Now I want you guys to feel it and explore and go, okay, cool. What's happening in this pose? I'm just going to do one. Okay. Knee into chest is. Now I want you to feel, this is a happy baby. My hip is in flexion. What if my bottom leg is straight? It's kind of pretty much in a neutral hip. Probably about 0 degrees. I'm not extending. Although my leg is extended, my hip is not in extension. Does that make sense? This leg. All right. If I externally rotated, my knee's going to come wide and my heel's actually going to come in. So I'm moving more into like a pigeon. That doesn't mean there's absolutely none. It just means this is getting a lot more external rotation, a little bit more flexion. I might just move my hips slightly out to the side, just so I'm getting more towards the outside of my body. It's going to give me a bit more space to move into more flexion. That make sense? I'm kind of highlighting the main movement in the pose because our body isn't like one thing happens in singular, all right? So things, you know, there's a lot of different movements happening at the same time, but it's often best to look at the main movement in that pose. For example, when you guys start breaking down poses, you might notice that, let's say in that pose Caroline was doing, I might look over towards that, which means there's a certain movement in the neck. There might be a certain movement in the wrist, but if it's a natural range, it's not something that I need to warm up. You know, I don't have to bring in a lot of neck movements. You can, but you don't have to, because it's not as if it's not like it's a lot of work for us to just look over to the foot. So kind of hone in on the main things. It's also going to help you guys to categorize the poses according to that. All right. Let's come kind of keeping with the hips. Let's move over to, okay, we kind of got external rotation down. Knee comes out to the side. We do a lot of external rotation. Another example would be, let me think of another. Oh, say that again.
Tree pose.
Tree pose. Yeah, yoga in general has a lot of external rotation. Okay, we do it quite a lot in poses. Another one, well, I don't want to get into too many examples because you guys are going to do them with your poses as well. Let me move over to internal rotation quickly. Okay, I can only think of two poses, maybe you guys can think of a bit more than me, that have internal rotation. Can you guys think of one?
Vajrasana, eagle pose.
Eagle, which leg? Right, feel it out, guys.
The top one, yeah.
Okay.
The top one.
This is an interesting one. Watch my top leg, all right? Here's my hip. I'm coming around and I'm moving in. So it's interesting because my hip is making more of a shape like this in the top, but I'm twisting it around. If I just twist it there, I'm actually more in a kind of like a curtsy position where my top hip is in a little bit externally. Internally is kind of like that. You guys see? So if I'm bringing my hip out to the side, there's external rotation. I'm rotating my hip out. If I had to rotate it in, doing something like this. So you might get a little bit more in the standing leg. You see how my bottom knee is coming in so that I can create space to hook? Do you guys see that? So the bottom knee is actually feeling, or the bottom hip rather, is kind of internally rotating so the other one can fit around. I think an easy example or a way to understand it for those who have kind of easy seated options is to find your way, it's kind of like a 90-90 position, but I'm going to start like this, all right? Got my heels planted about just wider than hip width. My knees are pointing up towards the ceiling. We're going to chat about this pose in yin yoga because we don't often get it a lot in yoga. But if I kind of, you know, when you windscreen wiper your legs from side to side, I bring both knees over to the right. This back leg, I hope you guys can see. What position is my right hip in?
External rotation.
External. What is this one?
Internal.
Internal, all right? So we're going over, same thing. This leg is external, this one's a little bit internal. Okay, that's kind of where you see it. One example, you know, it's not, we don't get a lot of internal, so we don't have to necessarily fret about it because we're not going to get a lot of poses, and so it's not going to form a massive, massive part. But yes, it's nice that we understand that we do get them external and internal. The same thing you kind of saw with the shoulders, opening out, rotating in. Okay, kind of got those hips down. Yes, Caroline?
I
Sometimes also in, oh, sorry.
Pardon?
Sorry, you go, Caroline?
No, I said I think I have one more internal. I just thought of it now. Is Marichiyasana, where you put your leg over and you can bind with you can do a twist. Marichiyasana, yeah. Can you see?
A little bit. So I'm bringing my knee into my chest. I'm bringing it across my midline. If I was doing a Ashtanga, most likely I would like squeeze my leg to the side and do it like that. You might get a little bit. It's not rotating as much in. It only needs to rotate a certain amount, but it's actually, yeah, a little bit. I think a little bit, but it's mostly hip flexion, right? Because I actually just need to get that knee into my chest and over to the side. I don't have to bring my knee too far, especially if the way that we do it in Vinyasa, we kind of just have it here, maybe a little bit, right? But even the poses that have like a wee bit of internal rotation doesn't form a massive part of the pose, right? In this pose, you would actually just work getting knee to chest and kind of work into the spine in order to get into Marichiyasana, right? Maybe loosen up, do a lot of twists where you can stretch through the glutes, because that's kind of where I feel the stretch in this one. Some might get it in the spine, but yeah, you'll start looking at poses a little bit differently and go, oh, I wonder what I am doing in this pose. So that was a nice creative one. I like that. Okay, cool. So let's see, how are we feeling? You guys are actually getting these concepts quite well. We've got this a bit. Let's play a little round of games, and then we will move slightly different. Let me see. Let's actually, I like that what Demi and I did with the shoulders. Let's see if we can get one with the hips. Just by a show of hands, you guys aren't warm. I'm not gonna get you guys into crazy positions. Who can quite easily get into lotus pose? Does anyone have lotus in their practice? Okay, so Helene, Caroline, was that it?
Half lotus.
Half lotus, okay, all right. So in half lotus, what position are we getting into the hips? Elena, was there a little bit? Sorry, some of you on silent. The main position of our hips in lotus. You guys have got it. It's very similar to cross-legged, isn't it?
External rotation.
External rotation, okay. Yeah, so there's external rotation. There we go. Helene is showing us a beautiful example of a lotus. Look, you could even go into more detail and say, okay, what position are her knees in? Not essential, but let's just practice it while we're here. Her knees are in?
Flexion.
Flexion, right. So bend, flexion, bending, knees are in flexion. Okay, cool. So she can quite easily get into a lotus pose. Oh, shit. Everyone's like, you don't have to, please. You can just observe, especially for those. I mean, for myself, lotus isn't a practice, a pose that I have in my practice. And it could be for various reasons, right? So Helene, how long when was the first time you did lotus? Have you always been able to do that? So kind of like.
Yeah, I have ridiculously long legs. So it's sort of, I feel as if I'm cheating when I'm showing off with lotus because it's always been easy for me.
So there's a couple of factors that come in with any hip movement specifically, and it's such a let me answer Demi first before we go into that.
Oh, I just wanted to actually ask if you can tell me if this is right, because I've never had somebody actually look at my half lotus before.
Let's see. Well, I mean, like, if I'm going to say what's right, I'm purely going on my understanding of alignment, right? Then I'm like, what do I think it's supposed to look like? How does it feel for you? Show us, and how does it feel? Okay. So Demi's in
very comfy.
Okay, so Demi's in more of a half lotus position. That just means her one sole of the foot is up. In order to move into full lotus, she would then bring the bottom ankle into the crease, her bottom sole of the foot into the other crease. Don't go there now, Demi, because we're not warm of such. I mean, Helene just popped her way into that. So different variations, all right? Obviously, full lotus is the full variation of the pose. Half lotus would be one of the things that we would use progressively. You might always stay. For me, I don't even go to half lotus. I'm still chilling in cross-legged position, all right? Like, admire you guys. But it's not because I'm not trying. It's not because I'm inflexible. It's not because I'm weak or anything. I think it's purely because I don't think my bones allow me to bend that way, just honestly. So do you guys remember the picture in the videos of the hip socket? All right. So remember we had pictures where the hip sockets itself are pointing out to the sides, very shallow, which means if I had kind of like, this would be the hip socket, this would be the head. Do you see there's so many different ways in which they can move there? I'm not saying this is the case with them because I haven't seen what their hip sockets look like, but just as an example, there's a lot of range in there. So if someone had kind of hip sockets that faced slightly outwards, were very shallow, what poses do you think would be quite maybe accessible to them very naturally?
Middle splits.
Middle splits, sending legs out to the side like shoops. There we go. Could be one. External rotation as well. Maybe things like pigeon pose.
Baddha Konasana.
Baddha Konasana. Maybe Baddha Konasana, knees flat on the floor. I think I do external rotators every day. Maybe you guys look like me. My knees are still like, they're not high, but they're like a good blocks distance off the floor, all right? But I can't really squeeze them any, like they don't go anywhere. It's not because there's tightness of such. Remember when we were speaking about one of the things, or many things that restrict flexibility, one can definitely be muscular. So for example, we spoke about forward folds. So what might restrict someone in a forward fold is their hamstrings, like you guys said, yeah? But then one of the other things, I mean, when we're speaking about muscles, we can say, okay, yes, the skin and the soft tissue and the ligaments and the tendons, all of those could also be bone, all right? If I had, let's think of someone whose hip sockets are maybe facing a little bit more forward and they were a little bit rounder, a little bit more closed. So do you see how I can't go anywhere before my bone hits bone? And it's like, I can stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch. It's only going to go so far. All right. So you might, it's hard to even say in a class, oh, I can't go further because my bone is hitting bone. It's not really like a sensation we're familiar with, but you can get to like, does it feel like there's muscles that are stopping me, or does it feel like I cannot go further? There's almost like bone on bone. There's this, it's like hitting a brick wall. I'm not going through the wall. All right. So just to understand, it's a big component of why poses look differently. Okay. So we had a few examples there. Is there anyone who still struggles to sit cross-legged? Like sitting cross-legged is a challenge for them. I mean, me, hand up. It's not a fun pose. It still feels difficult, right? So those are different options with regards to that. Helene mentioned about long legs. All right, let's quickly go into that a bit because we touched on that in the videos as well. Long legs, beautiful, beautiful long legs, can also make a lot of things quite challenging. Okay, but sorry, Helene, if you don't mind, would you mind doing a forward fold for us? If you don't mind, if you would so kindly do so.
Yeah, you've got me there. It took me a million years to get my hamstrings. Like when I started yoga, I could not touch my toes like this.
Okay, could it be a lot of things, right? What could stop Helene from forward folding a lot? What might be something that restricts her, might make it challenging for her?
Specifically with long legs, are you meaning?
Well, just in her case, it's not even with long legs. It's actually just for her. Could be with anyone, really. Tight hamstrings, yep.
Spine, your spine maybe.
So if she had tight, if her hamstrings were a bit tight, maybe spine. Yeah, I mean, if your hamstrings are tight, you would round a little bit more. So that's what you would notice. You would notice there's a little bit more spinal flexion. That would be something you would observe in your students, all right? Another thing would
are you specifically asking because she's able to do lotus like that? That so it might be that she would then have that her hips are just like in the other direction instead of, yeah.
I mean, we could not we can't assume what's happening in other people's hips.
Yeah.
I don't even know what my hips look like, so that's not really a realistic way to say to our students, like, I wonder, you can't be a lotus. I wonder if it's because your hip sockets are pointing forward. Don't, because we don't know, right? But it's actually, it's just to show you guys that it could be, right? The same thing as one hip could be different to the other, but that plays a whole different role in it. But specifically with regards to hip flexion, it's going to be hamstrings. Because she's got really long legs, I mean, we're all kind of built within proportion, but some people have longer legs and shorter torsos, longer legs, shorter arms, long arms, short legs, okay? So if we get someone who has really long legs and maybe, you know, not, let's say, normal arms, it's a long way to go to get my hands down to my feet, okay? I have one friend she's really short, but she's got really long arms. And so for her, things like handstands and arm balances are a little bit more accessible. So because she's short, she's tiny, she's lighter, short legs, so the levers are a little bit shorter, which makes the load for her a little bit less. Because Helene has quite long legs, if she had to do something like a handstand, she's got to kick a long way to get there. Her legs are longer. So because of length, there's going to be a little bit more load. It's further away from her body. She's got a harder lever to work with, all right? Doesn't mean, I mean, we're all built in proportion to be able to carry our own body weight. That's fine. Just going to be a bit harder for her compared to someone who's a little bit shorter legs and maybe longer arms. Yeah, we don't have to understand all the levers and the biomechanics of it yet. Just understand bodies are different. Okay. Man, I wish in the studio we would all stand next to each other. And this might be something you guys all want to do as a little bit of an exercise. No, I don't think it's going to help us now. So one of the things we would do, we're not going to do it now, is you sit up against the wall. And I'm sitting on my sitting bones, so I can see how long my torso is up to my shoulders. I could have everyone sitting next to me. Someone's shoulders would be up here. Someone's shoulders would be down there. We're all going to have different lengths. And then I would spin around and put my legs up the wall and see, okay, well, you had the longest torso, but you've got the shortest legs. All right. So combinations of it are very different. And that's something that we need to honor as a teacher, is that, you know, we can't say this is why you can't do it, but just know that it is something that can happen. Okay. All right, so we get lots of different bodies, lots of different things that we're all working on, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, hip ranges, joint movements. We're feeling pretty okay with that. Okay, cool. That's going to be one of your biggest components of, firstly, your anatomy homework 1, which is due next week. Okay, so you're going to look at your own flexibility. I would highly recommend, when, you know, for number 2, where you assess yourself and you do the seated hip flexion, I would recommend putting your phone on a little bit of a self timer and then taking a photo or taking a video and taking screenshots and look at what because sometimes it's hard to be like, oh, I've got 120 degrees. It's like you need someone to stand back and look, all right? So let's quickly see. If I'm seated, okay, I'm moving into a forward fold. What degrees, plus minus, are my hips in flexion at the moment?
90.
90.
Right, have we got that? So already now I'm in 90, because if I was standing, my legs would be down on the floor. So I've already gone halfway there, okay? So anything that I move forward from here is going to be adding on 90. So I can put my arms up and I can go forward. That looks pretty much good for me. So I would measure this angle, plus minus, don't pull out like your protractors and stuff, just a guess. And say round about how much have I got when I'm sitting, okay? And then also look when I'm standing. If I stand and move into my forward fold, oh, I need a bigger room. Okay, This is at 0. Round about there, I'm at
90.
And then I'm going to go down and see how far. That's probably where my hamstrings are now shouting at me a lot. And I can say, okay, well, comfortably, I can probably get it about 90, maybe 100 and not quite 145, maybe 130. All right. So I've still got a long way to go to be like Laura, right? So that's just something to keep in mind, that when you're doing seated, you're pretty much halfway there. Okay. Any questions about that?
I was just wondering, when we're in those positions, how should it feel? Like, what I'm trying to say is, should we be straining? Should we be going as deep as we can? Like, how do we?
This is more for your self assessment. So you would feel very different at the start of a practice versus the end of the practice. If you went for a run and you did some yoga, remember your muscles are warm. All right. Do you guys remember muscles are viscoelastic? So they're with warm, they kind of like, you might feel more supple after practice, but then somewhat your muscles always go back. They always bounce back to their normal elasticity in them. All right. So you might even want to feel what it's like before and after. There's no right way. I'm not going to be like, oh, you didn't get 180. Can't be a yoga teacher, right? That's not going to happen. It's more just for you guys to understand. Maybe you want to notice, where do you first feel the stretch? Where can you go actively? Chances are you can go a little bit further passively. So let's say, okay, this is me active, all right? Active means I'm using my own muscles to get me into the pose. So my arms are up. This is actually going to make it harder. I'm adding a little bit more load. I'm leaning forward. Okay, that's probably where I feel actively, all right? But I can hold onto my hands. Now I've kind of taken a little bit of the load off because I've got a bit of support. If I put my hands on the floor, it makes it a bit easier than when I've got my hands up here. But I can still hold on and I can pull myself a little bit further. My hamstrings are shouting a little bit. I can move that. It's kind of like a little bit more passive because I'm pulling myself in. It's not like I'm relying on my hip flexors to pull me into the pose. But someone, Catherine, could still come, and probably, not that we would ever want to push a student further, she probably could lie on me and I would maybe go another 1 or 2 centimeters first. So your active range will most of the time be a little bit less than your passive range. But what I want you guys to see is that when you're seated with your legs forward and you're folding forward, it might feel a little bit different. Maybe you even want to make a subjective note as to what it felt like in your hamstrings versus when you did an Uttanasana versus when you did a straddle forward fold. They're all forward folds. They're all hip flexion, stretching your hamstrings, but they all feel different. All right. I don't know how many of you, I'll get to you now, Demi. I don't know how many of you guys way prefer a straddle than a forward fold, like an Uttanasana. You guys have experienced that before? Okay, let's try it quickly. So come into a forward fold. You guys aren't warm. Please don't go to 180, not 100 degrees. So come into just a regular forward fold. So keep your legs fairly straight, but then just keep it quite passive. Just hang forward there. Okay. All right. Good. Come up a little bit, heel toe your feet quite wide into a prasarita or a straddle. Okay, now keep your hands where they are. So all I've done is I've made my feet wider. My toes are still pointing towards the front. Okay. Now go lean forward. Can you go further into the fold? It all looked like you guys did. Did you guys feel that? Why do we think that we might be able to go slightly forward in a straddle? Slightly more into hip flexion? Just spitball ideas.
Well, your legs are wider. Does that not help with abduction when your legs are wider?
So what does abduction do for us to fold forward? It's a bit of an abstract question. Let's see if we can get there.
It creates space.
There's space, right? Suddenly I don't have as much soft tissue just from like between my legs. I mean, I can only go so much before like my tummy hits my thigh, right? There's soft tissue there that's going to stop me. That's one of the restrictions, right? Move my legs out the way, I might go a little bit more further. It's going to be a bit more hip flexion, but you know what? I'm probably still feeling a stretch in my hamstrings. It's just a different shape, brought in a little bit of abduction. Okay, now we notice how different things show up in different poses. And all of our straddles look different. All of us felt different degrees of stretch, and so on and so forth. Okay, all right. How are we with that? Are we good? Do you guys feel, oh, sorry, Demi, yes, question.
I am backtracking a little bit when you said use the example of doing yoga and running. Now, I know in the stretching section, which is a little bit maybe ahead, but I wrote it down. So I've always been told that apparently, you know, we are told that stretching is weakness, and we now know that it's stretching is strength.
Mm-hmm.
But I still have it in the back of my mind, like you're not supposed to run and then do yoga, or I think it's do yoga and then run, because you've overstretched your body and now you're going to run, and it can put too much of a load on certain maybe finer motor movements and can hurt them. Is that true?
So, I mean, as you would have seen, stretching's not quite an easy topic to discuss, right? It's complicated. It's like super duper complicated, because now we're suddenly going, okay, well, how long are they stretching for? Are they stretching actively or passively? And as you saw with stretching, it's like, I lost myself off track there. But anyway, there's a lot of factors that we can explore with that. Have they stretched before? Is it something that they used to or not? So there's a lot of factors that come into play here. I think it's kind of like questioning now, okay, is stretching before or stretching after, is it bad or is it good? And I think it's also one of the things that we can't really look at in isolation without looking at the person in them. For me, as a person, I would love to stretch before I run. But for someone who never stretches, might not feel good for them, just subjectively. With regards to research as to whether, you know, looking at a running perspective, I would have to do more research into that, just to kind of look at it from a running cardio perspective rather than from a yoga perspective. Because in yoga, we don't necessarily do a lot. It's not really high impact, especially like running, which is like repetitive and quite intense compared to yoga. So I would be looking at it from a yoga perspective, but I wouldn't be able to then understand the components of running, because I'm looking at it from yoga, which is long holds, depending how the class you're doing. So let me sit with that for a while, and I'll get back to you. I'll do some research. Sasha, yeah, maybe you want to add on to this because you've done some stuff.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, from a personal training perspective, there was for a bit a very big scare of, oh my gosh, don't stretch before you do exercise. Your muscles gonna be, I laughed so much at Catherine today saying your muscles like all floppy now, and and I think that's genuinely what people thought, is your muscles floppy now and you're gonna start running and it's just gonna flop around and you're gonna hurt yourself and twist your ankle. But there's more evidence to show that if you are stiff and then you work out, whatever it is, running or weightlifting, you're gonna hurt yourself. So the general rule of sort of like what we know now is to do mobility work before you work out, which is like flexibility plus strength. And then after you work out, the benefits of stretching are a bit better than before. Again, like people don't really know what's going on, but that's sort of what we've been told, is like, don't worry about stretching before you work out, but definitely worry about it afterwards.
But interestingly enough, it's like there was also a lot of talk as to like, okay, before you run, should you stretch passively or should you stretch actively, with like incorporating more dynamic stretching things like high kicks or something, as opposed to just holding a Paschimottanasana or something like that. So I can only answer that from, for example, and we'll actually talk about this a little bit in yin, which is a long hold. It's a long passive hold for a couple of minutes. And remember in the videos, I think it was pretty much toward the end, Catherine speaking about there's a certain level of creep where it's kind of like your tissues stretch and they kind of go towards a more lengthened state. And then in yin yoga, they would say, don't go off and do something yang, like running or jumping, because we have somewhat put a little bit of stress on the tissues. We want them to recoil before we go and jump. But what I like what Sasha said is like, if I'm going to if I'm walking into the gym and I haven't stretched and I go do a deadlift with 100 kilograms, my hamstrings are definitely going to go, whoa, I have stretched way too much, way too soon. So I think also from a stretching might invite certain movements in order to work towards something. The same like doing a lunge before running, where you have that flexion extension pattern the whole time. So I can't give you a definite answer, but you see how we can look at it from a whole lot of different frameworks. And that's pretty much why exercise science in general has a lot of different research, because the runners say this and then the cyclists say this and the yogis are like, no, this. And stretching from a yoga point of view can also be seen with from a biomechanic, science point of view. So the answer is it's complicated. But yeah, it's interesting. I think also it's the, from a yoga teacher's perspective, we don't really want to come across or we don't want to cue or give any sorts of instructions that are kind of like instill fear in our student, to be like, don't stretch too far, you'll tear your hamstring. And then I'm like, okay, I'm never going to stretch further than what might be the first bit of sensation because I'm scared I'd tear something. Instead, focusing on empowering our students to notice what their sensation feels like. I mean, there's people that are doing crazy things with their body that they don't stretch and then they go run a marathon and they're fine, right? But someone else might be like limping the next day. So it really depends on the person, the kind of exercise that they're doing and what movements they're familiar with. Okay, I want to plant the seed about concentric and eccentric contractions so that you guys can sit with that for a while and we can explore that next week, because that specifically kind of weaves its way into strength and stretching. That is the main take home. All right, grab something next to you. I'm just going to recap what Catherine did. Just grab a water bottle or grab something that has some sort of load. Obviously, the lighter it is, if you're holding a balloon, it's not going to be a lot of a requirement from you. Let's use our bicep because it's kind of the easiest one to understand. And from there, let's see if we can weave it into the other muscle groups as well. All right. So I want you to hold it kind of like, if you can hold it sideways, don't spill something. All right. All right. Let's bring our elbow into flexion. So I'm bending my elbow. Okay. Now, if I had to, I want you guys from here to eccentrically control or eccentrically contract the muscle, your bicep. Let me see, not say the muscle. Okay. So what happens to a muscle when we do an eccentric contraction? It's contracting at what range? Long or short?
Long.
Long. Okay. Just looking at the biceps, longer. Okay. Concentric, long or short range?
Short.
Short range. Okay. So when we can put your bottle down. So if we think of it more in a yoga term, all right, when our muscles are at long range, eccentric, short range, concentric. Okay, let me give you guys another example. You guys are going to shout out. I'm going to do the movement looking at my hamstring. Okay. Whoops. I'm going to like kick my house down. Okay. My hamstring, back of my leg, doing this motion.
Concentric.
Concentric. Good. Straightening out.
Eccentric.
Eccentric, okay. So it's interesting how we look at our hamstrings in this position. We can look at it in another position, all right? Forward folds, we did this one as an example quite a bit. Hamstrings at the back of my legs, folding forward. What's happening to my hamstrings?
Eccentric.
Long range, they're stretched out, okay. What is really good about eccentric? Do you guys remember? One of the things that's really great about it? Kind of like the focus.
Oh, sorry. Or
Go
you
ahead,
can be
yeah.
more. Yeah, you can handle more weight going down than.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Not always more weight. Sorry, do you want to add on to that, Noel?
That's, yeah.
Sorry, just speak up. I think you're quite far. We can't hear you very loudly.
Sorry, no, I agree with Helene. I read somewhere that you could use more weight than if it was concentric. I don't know.
So if we think about more weight, it's like, okay, does it mean I can generally hold more load, or does it mean that I'm using more force? Does it mean I'm building more strength? So sometimes, especially as you guys would have seen in the talk, more wording is quite interesting, right? The language that we use with it is just because more would mean, okay, does it mean I'm actually holding more force, or I'm building more force, building more strength? So if I think about eccentric control is maybe a better way, because I can't say it can, but let's say it may be a better way to build strength. Even the same with dumbbells, I say bring it up, lower it down slowly, eccentric. But at the same time, when I'm lengthening or working at a long range with that muscle, I'm also working on my flexibility, right? So that's why we said there's still tension in my muscle when it's long, stretching, but it's still holding load. Does that make sense? Okay. What would happen if my hamstrings, or let's all stand up. It's the last 10 minutes, we can endure it. Okay. So extend your arms up. Just bring your hands at heart center. Start to hinge from the hips and come into a half Uttanasana, which just means you're somewhat at 90 degrees, shoulders in line with your hips, okay? Then just feel the back of your hamstrings. Are they on? They feel like they're working, so you can actually touch them. Feel what they feel like. Right, they're on. What would happen if your hamstrings were off? They weren't working. What do you think would happen? Oh, I can't hear you, Demi.
It would be like there would be no tension at all.
Yeah, if there were no
tension, flip forward.
You guys would fall on your face. Okay.
It would just be like.
So that's why. So yeah, that was kind of just what I wanted to show you guys, because I don't know if you actually did all the practicals in the video. But to show you that when we're working eccentrically, our muscles are on, they're still carrying load, they're still working, all right? They kind of being stretched in that way, but they're also, you can still build strength in eccentric, all right? If I gave you guys all a 10 kilogram weight to hold in your hand, it would add load, they'd be working a whole lot harder, okay? That doesn't mean what you guys said with doing more, you could hold more. It depends on what exercise you're doing, all right? If I have to think about someone at the gym who does a whole lot of these, let's say they hold a weight and they're doing like 1 million of these, and I'm just squeezing in and letting go, and they're focusing more on the concentric, I might be really strong in that contraction, or in that way of using the muscle, that when I stretch, it's still something that's not normal to me, all right? So it also depends on what previous exercise you have done. If I had to get them to do a deadlift or get them to do a forward fold, it could feel really tricky for them. It could feel really restricted. Maybe your hamstrings cramp. For those people who do a lot of yoga, you must see what it feels like when you kind of squeeze your heel towards your sitting bone. Sometimes your hamstring cramps because you're so used to working at long range. When you do short range, your legs are like, whoa, what is that? I've never done this before, all right? So with regards to whether it could do more or not, I think it also really depends, but eccentric is what works best for building strength and flexibility, right? So it's slow, lengthening, controlled, with moderate load, all right? Which means I'm not doing too much too soon. If I had to give you guys all a 10 kilogram weight and tell you to slowly lower down into forward fold, maybe some of you would be okay. For some of you, it might be too much. So what you'll do, hands at heart center, do a few. Arms up, do a few. Next time, maybe 3 weeks down the line, you're holding a block in your hand. A few weeks after that, 1 kilogram, 2 kilograms. And then you're like Catherine and you're holding like, I don't know, like a ton. I don't know what she does, but something crazy like that, okay? So it is progressively, that's kind of where the progressions work in with regards to building flexibility, but also with being able to progressively sequence or work on even the strength of our hamstrings in long range. Okay, have we got that? Questions? Yes.
I just have a question. I just want to make sure I get this. When you go down in chaturanga, you're going eccentrically, right? So that's an eccentric movement, and then when you come up, that would be concentric. or
For the
eccentric? Sorry.
triceps. For the triceps, yeah.
For the triceps.
So
Because
it's a hard one, right? So what is the main function of our tricep? What movement does it do? It straightens the arm. Okay. Well, yeah. Let's just think about it. If I had to concentrically contract my tricep, I'm just imagining that I'm squeezing my muscle. It's making my arm straight. Okay. So in a chaturanga, I'm going to do it from the side. I'm in a plank, slowly eccentrically lowering down. Concentrically will push my elbow to straighten. Concentric contraction of my triceps. So there was something, Catherine gave a nice example in the book as well. I'll try to find that for you guys. So in yoga, most of the time we're working quite a lot eccentrically. Well, I think you think forward folds and just chaturanga. Those are actually only two. But when we are wanting to build up strength in our students, because they've never ever been on their hands before, they've never done a push-up, and now they come to their first vinyasa class and we're like, cool, chaturanga. Whew, guys, those are hard, right? So if we wanted to build up and progressively work towards it, it's quite a nice movement because it's already working it's already working eccentrically, which means it's a nice way to build strength in the triceps, but we might need to take a little bit of work to get there. Okay, so let's try and think what would be, this will be our last example. Before we get on our hands and our knees, what would be quite a nice way to work the triceps as like the easiest variation, a chaturanga? I'm thinking not in our yoga class. Sorry, what did you want to say there, Zani? How can I take most of the load off that it's super easy?
Oh, I just wanted to say against the wall.
Against the wall, right? Okay. What makes against the wall so easy?
There's no load.
There's no load, right? I'm not putting like body weight on there. So I can do it against the wall. Okay. Let's say a little bit harder than doing it on the wall. What could I do in the yoga, on the yoga mat, in the yoga class?
On your knees.
On your knees, yes. Were you going to say that too, Caroline?
No, I was going to say cobra, and you can use a little bit of your spine to help you.
Yeah, so a little bit. I mean, you're just looking at more versus less load. So on my hands and my knees, I might slowly lower down just till there, and then come back up, and then push back. I could also go straight down to the floor, which I'm using a little bit of momentum. And if I put my hands here and I push, what kind of contraction am I doing with my triceps? Eccentric or concentric? What do we think?
Concentric.
Concentric, right? So it's actually a lot harder to push up, but you don't have to go all the way back up. So one of the nicest things to use is to just go down eccentrically quite slowly as far as you can, and then push up, and then work that until you can get to a chaturanga. Then you might go onto your toes. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. You could do the negatives where you're lying on your tummy and then you're pushing up to chaturanga. Those are quite hard, but you can also grade that too. You might be on the knees and just push into the hands slightly and do a bit of a cobra, but you're not really then pushing into the mat because your hands are still going to stay flat on the floor. So it's just a different variation. All right. So I wanted to plant the seed about those contractions. You guys seem like you got pretty cool understanding, obviously with triceps and hamstrings, because those are the ones that we work the most with. We want to build strength in our upper body, and we want to get flexible in our hamstrings. Those are like, those who come to yoga, it's like sometimes those are their two main goals. All right. Okay. Any last questions before we round up for today? Yes, Summer.
I just have one question about the anatomy work. You know, with the assess yourself, with the hip extension, I'm not quite sure. You just look at the lunge and then you do a pigeon, and then what exactly are you assessing? That was the only one where I couldn't quite understand.
Okay, so look at my lunge. Who's got I don't know you guys enough yet. So my hip extension, I want you guys to look at my hip. Okay. So I'm quite warmed up today, so it's not fair. So for me, Well, let's say if someone's quite tight in hip flexion, so hold on, scrap that, starting again. If someone had less hip extension, it would mean that they couldn't send their leg as far back. They might look like this. More hip extension, can you see I'm getting more, I might be able to straighten my leg. Some people may get way more, they might have a little bit of a kind of like more extension here if I went into slight back bend, all right? If I was super tight and I didn't have hip extension, I might not be able to even straighten my leg, that would be it. You guys see that? So look at your lunges. The other option would be in a pigeon, drawing your foot towards your pelvis, okay? This is more like those who are doing the back bend sequence, all right? Here's my pigeon. My hip bone, or my hip flexors rather, they don't quite get so low down. You see I'm still, that's the floor, there's my hip, okay? It could be a couple of things. It could be external rotation on my front leg, but what I can do is I can still bend this leg quite a bit in, all right? And then sink down lower. So now I'm really stretching through my quads. So it might be that I have tight hip flexors, all right, that are limiting me into extension. So you'll just see, can someone go all the way flat? Are they like all the way up here? All right, we don't measure hip extension as much because it's only 30 degrees into it, but this is where you might see it manifest in poses, right? Okay. So you'll see for some of them, they'll ask you to measure. So for the first 3, I want you to see if you can give a number. For external rotation, hip extension, you can give kind of like a subjective feedback to say, okay, cross-legged position for me feels hard. Try opposite shins in the front, doesn't make a difference. Not that, you know, could just be different hips. Pigeon, butterfly, and fire log is double pigeon. So shins are stacked. And if I look in front of me, they're like exactly like this. Okay, you're making like a little triangle, all right? So those are a bit more subjective. And then the rest should be fine. Okay, are we all feeling okay with the homework? Okay, so this is coming to me on the 13th. So it will be just before our chat. So I'll try and get feedback to you guys as soon as possible. And if any kind of major things come up and we get super duper confused, we've got a chat next week, Sunday, and we've got time. It's only like weekend 1, guys. You made it through. Cool. There's no other questions. Please go have a wonderful Sunday evening. Forget about anatomy for a little while. Maybe you'll dream of it. Maybe you're lucky. And then I'll probably only see you guys again later next weekend.
Perfect.
Cool.
Thanks. Bye.
Cheers, guys.
Have a great
Thanks,
week,
bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good week.
Bye.